Well, hey everyone, welcome to week number 4. I again thought I'd put up a little short video to welcome you to week 4 and then do a little quick wrap up on week 3. So I will make this one short. As I told you, I'm kind of in between trips right now. So just came back from one, turning around, jumping on a plane tomorrow and going for another one to DC. So make this real fast. Just a quick wrap up on week number 3. And week number 3, I'm working on grading your organizational worksheets. I'm also working on grading your journal entries, and I'm caught up to this moment in time, but I will go ahead and finish those up as they come in. The grading may be a little bit delayed because I will be out of town for the next 3 days. I should have a little bit of time to work on them maybe on Tuesday. So if it comes in Sunday night and I can't get to it, I'll probably get to it hopefully on Tuesday evening. But one way or another, I'll have your grades on both the worksheet as well as your journal entries. I'll have those grades ready for you by Wednesday at the latest. So I've enjoyed what I've read so far. It's interesting to see the culture of your organization and your worksheet. What I have seen is I've seen some commonalities in terms of a lot of the elements of a classic organizational approach represented in a lot of your organizations. Kind of this top-down, tall, hierarchical chain of command, unity of command, span of control, all these different elements that came to us from the classical school and people like Max Weber, other classical theorists like Frederick Taylor. I'm seeing a lot of those elements in a lot of your organizations. Not surprising, because even though we have about 150 years of organization theory literature at our disposal, despite all the research that's been done and all the theories and schools of thoughts that have been developed, for the most part, most of our public sector organizations still operate with those same classical components. They all still tend to be rule-bound. They all tend to be those tall hierarchies. They all tend to have division of labor and specialization of task. And so I'm not terribly surprised to see a lot of those classic elements within your organizations. I have seen another commonality has been a movement among organizations toward teamwork. A few people talked about fostering and promoting teamwork in their organizations. Again, that type of emphasis being placed on teamwork is a great way for leaders to embed a culture into the organization. A lot of folks have talked about dinners or recognitions for employees who are performing at high productivity levels. Again, that's a signaling device that leaders can use in order to show employees, this is something that I value as a leader. This is something that will be rewarded, that I will reward as a leader. Also, in terms of your journal article, your journal entries, I've seen some commonalities there as well. I've really enjoyed reading the intrinsic versus extrinsic motivators and where you feel you are in terms of which category of motivators really motivates you the most. I've seen a lot of personal growth type of motivators. I've seen a lot of self-actualization types of motivators. And so it's been interesting to see your take on what motivates you and whether you tend to be more intrinsically or extrinsically oriented when it comes to what motivates you as an employee. So we'll grade all those and get those back to you sometime on Wednesday at the latest. So into week 4. As we move into week 4, we are going to get into some of the major schools of thought in the development of the literature on organization theory. And so we'll talk about schools of thought such as the classical school, and we'll talk about people like Max Weber, Frederick Taylor, and you have a Frederick Taylor video and reading for this week. And we'll talk about Frederick Taylor's scientific management and what scientific management has meant for private as well as public sector organizations, as well as some of the criticisms and some of the flaws with scientific management. In the classical school, you also have the principles theorists, and so people like Fayle and people like Mooney and Gulick and those types of authors. But when we look at the classical school, there are some things that unify the classical theorists together, but there are also some things that will distinguish between the classical theorists. So in terms of what unifies them together is that all the classical theorists, for the most part, are searching for a magic bullet. They're searching for that one-size-fits-all approach. And if we can come up with this one way in which we can structure our organization or organize work, and we can apply it across all of our organizations, we can then make our organizations effective and efficient. So they're all looking for that one panacea, that one cure-all, if you will. However, what separates those classical schools or classical theorists is when you look at their focus. So they're all looking for the one best way to do it, the one-size-fits-all approach, but the way in which they applied it is differently. So with Weber, he was looking for the one-size-fits-all approach to structuring your organization. So he was a very structural type of theorist, and he was interested in, well, how can we best structure our organization through a tall hierarchy and chain of command and specialization of tasks in order to make our organizations efficient and effective. He really believed in this ideal bureaucratic structure. Taylor, also looking for the one best way, but rather than focusing on structure, Taylor focused much more on processes and procedures and doing the work itself. Scientific management was all about deconstructing jobs into their component elements and then looking at each one of those components of a job, finding the most effective components and most efficient components, and then getting rid of the inefficient ones. So all those most efficient movements we will cobble together into what he called the one best way to do the job. The principal theorists, however, their focus was more on trying to provide a toolkit for our managers. So they wanted to really drill down on what do managers do on a daily basis. And if we can teach those managers how to do those things in a more efficient way, that will then in turn make our organizations more efficient. And so take, for example, the school of thought that comes out of Luther Gulick and his POSCORB school. POSCORB is that acronym that stands for planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting. So planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting is this acronym known as POSCORB. And what Gulick believed is that those are elemental functions of every single manager in an organization. So if we could teach our managers how to do each one of those functions efficiently, we are in essence creating a managerial toolkit that we can then give to our managers. They then can then pull out the appropriate tool from that toolkit to use in the appropriate situation. So again, all three of those approaches, whether it be the principal school or the scientific management of Taylor or the ideal bureaucracy of Weber, they're all unified and they're trying to find the one best way to do it, trying to find that magic bullet. But what differentiates them is in terms of their focus. Structural for Weber, procedural, process-based for Taylor, and more of a principles type of approach for Gulick. That's your classical school, and that's kind of where we're going to start this week. And that's where the organization theory literature really begins, is in that classical school. But we found that there are a lot of problems with some of those classical theorists. One of the major problems with the classical school is that the classical theorists had a very dehumanizing approach to how they dealt with employees. Employees were simply cogs in the machinery, according to Frederick Taylor. Frederick Taylor, in some of his writings, actually referred to employees as being boorish beasts. So he basically meant that if they're a cog in the organization, they are replaceable. So if you picture a machine and cogs all have teeth on them, and as a tooth of one cog pushes against the tooth of another cog, it makes them turn, makes the whole machine go. However, if a tooth breaks off of a cog, you don't fix it. In the classical school, you take that cog, you throw it away, you replace it with a new cog. So people are just replaceable types of parts of the organization, and not terribly important parts of the organization. So what we then had developed after the classical school, because of some of these criticisms, So what came to be known as the Human Relations School. So in the Human Relations School, you have people like Elton Mayo and his Hawthorne experiments, where he decided, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to see the impact if you change a physical stimulus on an employee, such as the lighting level in the factory. What impact will that then have on employee productivity? You would think if you turn the lights up, they'll become more productive. And indeed, he found that, and that confirmed his hypothesis. But if you turn the lights down, you would think that conversely, it would then make them less productive. But he found in turning the lights down, people actually became more productive. And the way in which he explained that is because people are being paid attention to in the study. These folks who are working in this plant as part of this Hawthorne experiment, for the first time, they were being listened to. They were being talked to. They were having their opinions heard. And that had never really happened to them before. And so by being listened to and by being valued, they worked harder and they became more productive. And Mayo also found that groups were really important as well. And I know some of you talked about that in your week 3 assignments, where you talked about the importance of teams and groups. Groups are very important organizations, in that when people work together in a group, if one member of the group is not pulling his or her weight, the remainder of the group will then place pressure on that individual to get that individual to work harder. And so these group dynamics are something that have were not really considered in the classical school. And it's something that's relatively new to the School of Human Relations. One of my favorite authors in the Human Relations School is actually what I sometimes refer to as a pre-human relations theorist, and that's Mary Parker Follett. And Mary Parker Follett contributes to the Human Relations School by telling us that when we manage our organizations, we manage them as democratic organizations. And so the same types of flaws and the same types of problems that exist in a democracy will also exist in an organization. And again, I don't want to make this video too long, but Follett tells us that much like James Madison told us, in a democracy, you have very passive citizens, in that in a democracy, the way in which people usually participate in their own governance is through voting, a very passive way. They usually don't take more active steps in order to participate, and a lot of people don't even vote. So they don't even take advantage of that very passive way of participating. But then the second flaw that you have in democracy, and this is something Madison talked a lot about in the Federalist Papers, especially in Federalist Paper number 10, and that's this issue of factions. By having a democracy, you are going to, by definition, have a lot of different opinions. You'll have different groups that have different opinions. These different groups with different opinions will invariably come into conflict with each other. So how a democracy resolves conflict will say a lot about how effective that democracy is. Follett argues that organizations are a lot like democracies. So in an organization, you are going to have participation on the part of your employees, and you're going to have different employees and different groups of employees who have different opinions and different ideas. They are naturally going to come into conflict with each other. And it's up to the organization to manage that conflict effectively, kind of like we had talked about in a preceding week. The way in which you can manage that conflict, there are 3 different ways you can do it. One is through domination. One person wins, one person loses. That, according to Follett, is the worst way to do it. The second way is negotiation. We sit down, we talk, you give up something, I give up something, we come to a resolution. That's better than domination, but it's still not the ideal. For Follett in an organization, the ideal way to deal with conflict was through what she called integration. You get people together. Once they get together, they share ideas and share opinions. And the opinions of one person will interpenetrate into the thought process of another and vice versa. And by having this type of interpenetration of ideas, you can then integrate all these ideas together and basically synthesize them into a new way of solving a problem, a new way of looking at an issue. And when you synthesize it all together into this new way of looking at the issue, you don't have losers. Everybody wins. It's a way in which everyone can win as a result of dealing with the conflict. But in order to do that, according to Follett, you need participation. You need to value your employees. You need to have them participate in the life of the organization and the decision-making that goes on within that organization. So you can see how from the classical school, we then move into the human relations school by placing more of a value upon human beings. Some other authors we'll talk about this week in the human relations school, people like Douglas McGregor. Douglas McGregor, as a human relations, or sometimes they call him a human resource management theorist, is best known for his differentiation between what he calls theory X and theory Y. So he says in organizations, you can have two different types of employees. Theory X employees are lazy, they're not terribly creative, they are not really inclined toward doing work, not terribly intelligent. Theory Y employees are just the opposite of theory X. They are creative, they are intelligent, they are willing to work, they are willing to accept responsibility and accountability. The problem, according to McGregor, with these two different types of employees is that, according to him, the majority of the employees in our organizations are theory Y employees. However, the majority of our organizations are theory X organizations. So we are shoehorning these very creative, intelligent theory Y employees into a classical theory X organization, much like what we got from Max Weber and Frederick Taylor in the classical school of thought. What happens there is that when you have theory Y employees who want to grow and want to develop their skills, like a lot of you talked about in your journal for week 3, when you have a lot of employees like that who are clearly theory Y employees, a theory X organization inhibits that person's growth. It places obstacles between that person and where they want to be and how they want to grow and move up in the organization. So we essentially have a mismatch. Theory X organizations and a majority, not all, but a majority of our employees are theory Y employees. So what McGregor and then his student Chris Argyris tell us in the Human Relations, Human Resource Management School is they tell us it's incumbent upon organizations to change in order to meet the needs of employees. So it's no longer asking what can the employee do for the organization, but it's also asking what can the organization do and how can the organization change to help meet the wants, needs, and desires of its employees. So it's complete whole-scale sea change in the way in which we think about our organizations. It's no longer only about the organization, but it's also about the people within the organization. So you can see how we have transitioned from the classical school to the human relations, human resource management school. And I'm not going to go through all the schools of thought. We just don't have time tonight. But one more that I will mention in our progression is what's called the systems school and systems theory. In systems theory, when we approach studying our organizations, we study our organizations as kind of ecosystems. And so there are two approaches to the systems theory. There's the closed or natural system, and there's the open system. The closed natural system, you're focusing internal to the organization. And what oftentimes happens with a lot of these natural systems theorists is they end up viewing the organization as being a living organism. And so just like any living organism, the primary goal of that living organism is probably going to be survival. So that living organism will regulate its temperature, body temperature, its blood pressure, its pulse ox levels. So if you've got an organism that is devoid of illness, that has a regular blood pressure, normal blood pressure, has normal pulse ox and all those vitals, you can say that that organism is in harmony with itself. Same type of thing with organizations. So when everything's working well in the organization, we have organizational harmony. And that's the primary goal of the natural systems theory, is to get the organization to achieve that level of organizational harmony, that balance with all of its internal working mechanisms and parts. The 25-cent word that's used in systems theory for that balance is what's called homeostasis. So at the point of homeostasis is where the organization is in balance with itself. Then there's another approach to systems theory called the open systems approach. The open systems approach looks beyond the walls of the organization and looks at the external environment and asks the questions about how does the organization interact with its environment, and how does the environment interact with the organization. That environments can place a lot of different stimuli and a lot of different influences upon an organization, whether it be money resources, appropriations, whether it be labor pool that you can get out of your environment, whether it be political support from elected officials in your environment. There are a lot of different resources that can flow into an organization from its external environment. The open systems theorists study organizations to look at the dynamics in the relationship between the organization and the environment. And the point of homeostasis for an open systems theorist will be a balance between the organization and that organization's external environment. So when the organization is in balance with its external environment, that's where we achieve this point of homeostasis. Now, one of the major differences between the natural approach and the open approach is not just in terms of the focus, which is internal for natural and more external for open, but another major difference is in terms of the life cycle of an organization. So natural systems theorists believe that from the moment of organization is created, just like a living organism, it begins to decay. It starts going through its life cycle process, starts going through its maturation process, and as it goes through this maturation process, it begins dissipating energies out into the environment. And once that organization has dissipated enough energy out into the environment that it no longer has enough resources to survive, that's when the organization goes out of existence. It's a process known as entropy. So just like a living organism will go through an entropy process and decay and die, an organization goes through this entropy process as well. And that's for the natural systems theorists. So they really don't see another conclusion, if you will, for an organization other than finishing the entropy process and going out of existence. The open systems theorists believe that entropy is not just a one-way street. And yes, they will admit that organizations, as they age, dissipate energy into the environment, but they can also claim new energy and new resources from the environment and bring new resources into the organization to stave off decay and death. And so by bringing these new resources into their organization from the environment, they're engaging in what the open systems theorists refer to as negative entropy. So they're able to survive in the future by bringing in new energy to replace the energy that the organization has lost. So systems theory is really a fascinating way to look at organizations, because we're just not looking at the organization itself, but we begin looking at the environment that surrounds the organization and asking the question about, does the organization have the resources to, does the environment have the resources to sustain that organization? Sometimes environments can decay as well. If the political support goes away for an organization, the appropriations will probably go away. And when the appropriations go away for an organization, eventually the organization is probably going to go away as well. And even if it doesn't go away, if it loses its appropriations, it's going to have to look to new sources of revenue. It may have to look to donors. And once it starts looking to donors instead of getting appropriations from a legislative body, then it's a brand new ballgame. And that organization is going to take on different functions and different goals and a different mission once it has a different revenue stream. But one of the things that we will recognize as we go through the development of organization theory literature, and we haven't gone through all of it here tonight, this is just a quick video. There are modern approaches and quality management, other types of approaches we'll talk about this week. But one of the threads, if you will, that ties the entire chronological development of organization theory literature together is a movement away from the one-size-fits-all approach and a movement more toward contingency types of theories. That under the Max Weber classical school, here's the ideal bureaucracy, apply it to every organization will then be efficient and effective. Today we recognize that's not possible, that every organization is different, that every situation is different, that every environment is different, so we have to study our organizations differently. And how you study a small state-level organization is going to be much different than the way in which you would study a large federal-level department, for example. So as we have moved through our development of our understanding of organizations, we have moved more toward this contingency-based type of an approach. Obviously, the contingency-based approach is a much more nuanced, much more complex approach, which is good because it helps us to understand our organizations better, and we are not just trying to shoehorn organizations into a pre-existing theory, but the downside is the same thing, it's complex, which means that it's more difficult for us to study our organizations, and our study of public organizations today is far more nuanced than it was in the late 1800s, in the early 1900s. But the focus for this week really is to look at this chronological development of the organization theory literature to identify the different schools of thought, how they developed, and what they are. So just to wrap up very quickly, again, I don't want this to run too long, a couple of assignments that you will have this week. One, you have quiz number 2, so don't forget about that one. But then the second assignment, your writing assignment, is your theorist essay. And this one is kind of wide open the way in which it's designed. So you will prepare an essay on one of the theorists covered this week, and it's up to you to select the theorist. You can select any of the theorists that are talked about in the materials and the resources this week. Discuss that theorist and that theorist's contributions to our understanding of organization theory. So pretty wide open type of assignment. It's done that way by design so that you can select whichever theorist you want to or you feel passionate about and write about that theorist and how that theorist has contributed to our understanding of organization theory. So I'm sorry I went on a lot longer than I promised to, but I hope some of this information is helpful to not only provide some background to the reading that you're going to be doing and the materials for this week, but also give you a little bit different take. You know, I always think in my classes that it's helpful that you've got the readings, you've got all the resources provided for you in the classroom, but it's also good to have another way of looking at it. And so I like to try and give you that other way of looking at the development of the organization theory literature. So that's week number 4. I hope everyone has a wonderful week. Like I said, I will be returning to town sometime on Wednesday evening. We'll wrap up this week's grading by Wednesday evening, and then we will move onward and upward in the class. So have a great week, and I will talk to you again next week.